Test, test. Are we good? Test, test. Is it on? Is it? Okay. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. So we're in Daniel chapter 8. Just a couple things real quick. So last week in chapter 7, we saw quite a few characters. So there were 4 beasts, but really the fourth one was the main one we focused on. And out of the fourth beast came a little horn, which we equated that to the Antichrist, which you end up seeing in Paul's writings in the New Testament as well as John's writings in Revelation. So it was a precursor or a preview for all those events that were going to come. We saw God the Father, and then we saw the Son, the Messiah, in chapter 7. Just a couple points about that. So the little horn, which is the Antichrist, people debate about who or what that is. Is it a single individual? Is it any individual that behaves in a certain way? Is it a group of individuals? Does it represent a political figure, a religious figure, etc.? I was just going to comment that if it represents a political figure, which some people assume it does, and it's a first century political figure, then the most popular view generally is that it would represent Domitian, who is one of the Caesars near the end of the first century that persecuted the Christians very heavily. And so perhaps that's who it's referring to. But anyway, so with that in mind, we'll move into chapter 8. Chapter 7 is a bit hard to understand in places, and there's a lot of debate about what certain sections mean and who or what these things are referencing. Chapter 8, on the other hand, is a lot more straightforward. Most people agree on what chapter 8 is talking about, and so there's not a lot of debate, really. It's more straightforward, and it's more agreed upon than what chapter 7 is. So in chapter 2, we had a vision for Nebuchadnezzar where he saw a statue that represented 4 nations. Those same 4 nations reappear in the vision in chapter 7. But now in chapter 8, we're going to focus on just 2 of those 4. So the same idea is going to come back up, but we're going to look at 2 of the 4 nations instead of all 4 of them. And it'll be pretty obvious quickly which 2 they are. So with that in mind, we'll start in chapter 8, verse 1. It says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar." So Daniel's telling us when he had this vision, so it's still when the Babylonians were in control. Chapter 7, he had the vision in the 1st year of Belshazzar. This vision he has 2 years later, while Belshazzar is king. Depending on the timing, so this would have been roughly around 548 BC. Some people date it a little different, but that's approximately about 548 BC is when he would have had this vision. All right, so it says, "A vision appeared to me, to Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time." So in other words, this one occurred after the thing I just talked about in chapter 7. Verse 2, it says, "I saw in the vision, and it so happened, while I was looking, that I was in," the New King James says Shushan. It's Susa is probably the place you're more familiar with. I'm not really sure why the New King James says Shushan, but anyway. So it says Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. "And I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulah," and other translations say the canal. So it's actually a canal. Ulah was a canal northeast of the city of Susa. All right, so Susa is one of the main cities in the Medo-Persian Empire. It was their winter capital city. And you may recognize the name Susa from the story of Esther. So in Esther, she lived in the city of Susa, and when she became queen, that was the city that she was in when she was queen. So it's the same location that you read about, in the book of Esther. Okay, so but the thing you need to notice here is he's not literally in Susa. He sees himself as being there in the vision. Okay, so he's not physically there. This is just where the vision is taking place. All right, so verse 3, it says, "Then I lifted my eyes and saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram which had two horns." So we're going to see two nations in this chapter. The ram is the first nation that we're going to see. And so we'll read a little bit about what the ram is, and then we'll talk about who it is. So it's a ram which has two horns, and the two horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. All right, so this is the same kingdom as the bear in chapter 2. Okay, sorry, not chapter 2, chapter 7. So he's talking about the Medo-Persian Empire is what this is. So it has two horns. Both of them are great horns, but one ends up becoming larger than the other. And what that's referring to is the Persians become greater than the Medes. So even though it's the Medo-Persian Empire, it's really the Persian Empire is the stronger component of it. So what happened was when, let me make sure I'm not getting it backwards. The one who took over the Medo-Persian Empire, I think it was Cyrus, maybe. I may be wrong on that. But anyway, he ends up defeating his grandfather. So he's in control of the Persians. His grandfather's in control of the Medes. He ends up defeating his grandfather, uniting the two together. But the Persian half of it is stronger than the Mede half of it. And that's what this is referring to here when it says one horn is bigger than the other. Okay, so verse 4, it says, "I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward." So the Medo-Persian Empire is going to dominate the ancient Near East, but they're going to start from the east, and from the east they're going to go west, north, and south. So when they come from the east and go west, they're going to conquer the Medes, the Palestine-Israel area, Egypt, Syria, and kind of all those places in that area. So that's what it's talking about. It's going to push from the east and take over everything going west, north, and south, basically. So that no animal could withstand him. So in other words, the Medo-Persian Empire was the strongest empire at the time. Nobody could really stand up to them. It says, "Nor was there any that could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will and became great." Okay, so Daniel's going to use this word great, or if you have a different translation, you might say, well, the ESV says great as well. He's going to keep using this word over and over again with some modifiers to it. And so what's going to end up happening is the Medo-Persian Empire is going to be great, but then the next empire is going to be exceedingly great, and then someone's going to come out of that empire who's going to be even more exceedingly great. But what it's talking about when it's talking about great is, yes, they're powerful, and yes, they're taking over other people and lands and so forth. That's not really so much what it's getting at. The greatness here is referring to their arrogance, okay? So what it's talking about is the Medo-Persian Empire is the main ruling authority during this time, and because there's no one to challenge them, they become exceedingly arrogant in the process, okay? And that's typical of humans in general. When you have a lot of power and it's unchecked, then you tend to be tempted to become arrogant in the process, and that's what happened to them. So they're going to be the major world empire from around the 530s when they defeated Babylon to roughly 331, I think it is, when Alexander the Great defeats them. So for about 200 years, they're going to be the world empire in that part of the world. No one's going to really challenge them, and they are going to, in turn, become more and more arrogant because of their power. And so that's the first creature that we're going to see in this chapter. And he may have chosen the ram because I think they did use the ram as one of their symbols for their country, and that may be the case. The other thing is, it's a ram, but a ram is a type of sheep. And so the next animal we're going to see in a second is a goat. And maybe we think about little goats. But in this scenario and the animals that he's talking about over in that part of the world, the goat is stronger than the ram or the sheep. And so that's why the ram that we're talking about here is ultimately going to get beat by the goat that we're going to see in just a second because the goat's a stronger animal. Okay, so Kingdom 1 is simply the Medo-Persian Empire, okay? All right, Kingdom 2 now starts in verse 5. It says, and as I was considering, and what that means is Daniel doesn't know what the vision is about at this point. No one has explained it to him yet. And remember, for him, all of these things are off in the future, so he doesn't know what this is talking about. Remember, at this point, he's still serving in the administration of the Babylonians. The Medo-Persian Empire isn't even a thing yet that is challenging the Babylonians. So this is all off in the future for him, and when he sees these visions initially, he doesn't know what they're about. And that's why the angel has to explain it to him. All right, so verse 5, it says, and as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from, so the ram came from the east and ran west. This goat is going to come from the west and run east. So obviously they're going to meet because they're running in opposite directions towards each other. So it says, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And so that indicates that this animal is very fast. And when it moves, it doesn't even touch the ground. It's so swift. And so if you remember from the last chapter, the animal that represented this was a leopard with eagle wings. And so that's the same idea, is that it moves very rapidly, very fast, and causes a lot of destruction in the wake of it. All right, so continuing on in that verse, it says, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. So the goat's going to start off with this single horn. So the ram had two horns, which represented the Medes and the Persian side of their empire. But this goat is going to start with one single horn. And so the goat represents the Greek Empire, and the single horn represents Alexander the Great. Okay? So they have a single ruler initially that is going to lead them. All right, so verse 6, it says, then he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his two horns. So it mentions here that the goat has rage towards the ram. And the reason for that is when you go back and look at the Medo-Persian Empire, they actually multiple times they tried to advance into Europe, and they fought against the Greeks. And the Greeks were the only ones who actually ever stopped the Medo-Persian Empire. So multiple times they went into Europe, tried to conquer Greece, got defeated, and they would retreat and pull back, and then they tried it again later. But they did conquer some of the Greek territory, and in the process of that, that made the Greek people really angry with the Medo-Persian Empire. They didn't like them. So when Alexander got power and had enough power to be able to defeat them, that's why he's going to advance against them and try to destroy them. And so that's why it says when the goat does finally confront the ram, it's going to do so with a lot of anger for what has happened in the past between the two of them. So continuing on in verse 7 in the middle there, it says, there was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. And so what that's talking about is all the conquered people that the Medo-Persian Empire conquered, none of them came to the support of the Medes and the Persians. So even though they had conquered a lot of people and made them subject under them, none of them rose up to try to defend them against the Greeks. They just let them fall to Alexander in the process. So Alexander, his rule was fairly short-lived, and he defeated the Medo-Persian Empire in 3 years at 3 different battles. I think the years were, I have it written down, but it'll take me a minute to look, and it's not super important, but I think it's 331. It's over a 3-year period. Anyway, at 3 different battles. Anyway, at the end of that 3 years, he defeats the Medo-Persian Empire and takes the whole empire over. So at this point, once Alexander the Great has defeated them and has conquered essentially the whole ancient Near East, he is the most powerful man in the world at that point. He has the largest empire. And he is at the height of his power at that point. All right, so with that in mind, so verse 8, it says, therefore the male goat grew very great. So if you notice earlier, it said the Medo-Persian Empire was great. Now it says the goat is very great, okay? So that means he is gaining in power, but he's also gaining in arrogance as a result of his success. And it says, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it, 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And so what that's referring to is Alexander the Great conquered a lot of the known world at the time. He was very powerful. His ascension was very fast. So his father was a great military man before him, and Philip of Macedon is his father. And then he carries that on. But I think he became king when he was around 21-ish. So he's quite young. And he only really, all of his success was only about a 10-year period of time. And then he just suddenly died in his early 30s. So he didn't last a long time. So even though he conquered the whole ancient Near East and the known world at the time, became very successful, had a lot of power, he died at a very early age. And when he died, he did have 2 very, very young sons, but they weren't old enough to succeed him. And so when he died in his early 30s, the empire didn't really have a natural successor. And so what happens is they murder his 2 sons so they won't be a threat. And his empire gets split among 4 of his generals. And so 2 of the 4 are worth mentioning for the purposes of this class. So one of them is Ptolemy. So you'll hear about the Ptolemean Empire and rulers and so forth, especially when you study the intertestamental period between Malachi and the Gospels. They kind of come into play. They're ruling down in Egypt. And then the other is Seleucus, who takes over kind of the Syria-Palestine area and so forth. And so he's the one who becomes relevant for what we're going to talk about now. So he takes over, and then you get what's called the Seleucian Empire or rule that's going to end up taking over the area that Daniel's concerned about for the purposes of this book. All right, so that's what it's talking about in verse 8 here. So let me just reread that and kind of piece it together for you. It says, therefore the male goat grew very great. So Alexander becomes very great. But when he became strong, so when he hits the height of his power, it says the large horn was broken, meaning he dies. And in place of it, in place of him, 4 notable ones come up toward the 4 winds of heaven. So in other words, when he dies, the empire gets broken into 4 Greek empires ruled by 4 of his generals, okay? So the kingdom is split at this point into 4 smaller kingdoms. All right, verse 9, it says, and out of one of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. All right, so you have 4, the kingdom has split into 4 smaller kingdoms now, one of which is the Seleucian Empire that's in the kind of the Syria-Palestine area. And so now we're going to talk about what happens within that subset of the empire. And so it says there in verse 9, out of one of them, meaning out of the Seleucian part of the empire, came a little horn which grew exceedingly great. Okay, so first thing to know, this is not the same little horn from chapter 7, so don't get it confused. They're two different horns, two different people, two different ideas. All right, so it's not the same as chapter 7. So what it's talking about is someone is going to arise out of the Seleucian dynasty to rule this particular area of the Greek kingdom, okay? So I'll just go ahead and tell you who this is. So originally his brother I think it's Seleucus IV, was ruling the area. He was the king for this area, and he ends up dying. And what happens is it should have fallen to his son to succeed him. But his brother was very conniving, and through some trickery and bribes and so forth, he ends up stealing the kingdom from his nephew, and he ends up becoming the ruler, and that's who this is talking about. So who is that guy? This guy is Antiochus IV. He's called Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He gives himself the name Epiphanes, which that means like exalted one or God magnified. He's declaring himself a deity by giving himself that name, okay? So it literally means magnified. So he calls himself Antiochus IV magnified is what it means, okay? But he was really more of a very erratic behavior, kind of a madman type guy. So his own people, when he wasn't around, instead of calling him magnified, they called him madman. And the words look similar in rhyme in Greek, and so it's kind of a play on word. But they knew he was crazy, basically. And so he was very erratic in his behavior. Anyway, he's going to rise up and he's going to rule over this part of the kingdom. And he's going to rule, if I can find the dates, 175 to 164 BC. So we are now, what this part of the vision is about is going to be getting close to 400 years in advance of the time Daniel's living, okay? So this is way off in the future compared to where Daniel is at. And so you can see why this is going to be confusing to him. He's not going to know what this is about until it's explained to him and so forth. Okay, so let's see what it has to say about Antiochus IV as we go through here. So going again at verse 9, it says, and out of one of them came a little horn, which is Antiochus IV, which grew exceedingly great. So we saw the Medes and Persians were great. We saw that Alexander the Great was very great, but Antiochus IV is going to be exceedingly great, okay? Now, remember, great it does refer to power, but it really more refers to their arrogance, okay? So of all of them, he is the worst, and worst by far, okay? Okay, so he's going to go toward the south. So remember, he's ruling kind of Syria, Palestine area. He does attack Egypt at one time, so that's why it says he goes south. He goes toward the east. He does attack some places in the east. And it says toward the glorious land. And that means he's going to go towards Jerusalem and Israel and do things there that God's going to be upset about. All right, so verse 10, and it says, and it grew up to the host of heaven. So in other words, his greatness, meaning his arrogance, went up towards the host of heaven, towards God. And it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground. And so this is a reference to God's people or the saints, the holy ones that we saw in the previous chapter. He's going to do some things that are going to harm the saints. And the stars the stars may be a reference back to the promise to Abraham. Remember, it talked about how his descendants would be as numerous as the stars. And so this is talking about his arrogance is going to go up before God. It's also going to harm some of God's people. And then it goes on at the end of the verse, and it says, and tramples them. Verse 11, it says, he even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. Prince of the host there is an expression for God himself. And so it's saying he's going to exalt himself as high as God, which he did with his name that he gave himself, Antiochus IV magnified, okay, or Epiphanes is the word. So he did that. He even minted coins that said Antiochus IV Epiphanes on them, which was his way of kind of declaring himself God. And it says, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away. So this is what he's going to do, okay, in Jerusalem specifically. The daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. So what he ends up doing, and he gets some of the prominent Jews to side with him in this, and it's God is going to condemn those Jews here later in the chapter. But he gets some of the prominent Jews to adopt Greek culture, and in the process, they basically quit teaching the law. They eliminate circumcision. And then what he does specifically, he passes some laws. So they cannot offer sacrifices in the temple anymore. If they are caught with a copy of the Torah, they will be killed. He burns all of the copies of the Torah he can find. And then a little bit later on, he is going to send a delegation there to collect taxes, and he's going to trick the people into thinking it's a friendly delegation, but the military comes as well. And he's going to trick them, and he's going to end up killing a bunch of them in the process. And what he ends up doing is he steals all of the holy elements out of the temple, so the lampstands and all that stuff. He steals all that, takes it all away. He erects an altar to a pagan deity on top of God's altar, which some people think was probably an altar for Zeus that had a resemblance to him on it. So he erects a pagan altar on top of the actual altar. He ends up offering sacrifices on that altar to pagan gods, probably including swine, but that's a bit of a speculation. And he actually wanders around in the temple and goes into the Holy of Holies himself, okay? And so he does all this to completely desecrate the temple. And he actually, I have the dates for this. Let me see if I can find them for you. So on December 6th of 167, and I'm not going to promote the Apocrypha, but if you've heard of the books, the Maccabean books and the Apocrypha, they're not inspired writings, but the ones that are called 1st and 2nd Maccabees and so forth, they are generally considered to be historically accurate, though not inspired, okay? And so if you read in 1st Maccabees, for instance, it records a lot of this and what Antiochus did. So that's how we kind of know some of this information. So in 1st Maccabees chapter 1, verse 54, it says he erected a detested thing of desolation on the altar in the temple to defy God. And then in 2nd Maccabees 6, 1 through 2, it suggests that the altar may have resembled Antiochus himself. So he did that on December 6th of 167. About 2 weeks later, on December 16th of 167, is when he offered the first pagan sacrifices on that altar, which again is recorded in 1st Maccabees and 2nd Maccabees. This might have included some pigs offered on it. He burned all the copies of the Torah, and I think that's the gist of it. So you can tell how he's a very arrogant man, but he also does things to magnify himself as God and tries to diminish the real God in the process. The unfortunate thing is some of the Jews went along with it and were happy about it. They adopted Hellenism. They built a large gymnasium in Jerusalem to mimic Greek culture. They started participating in Greek games and did all these things. So it's not just him. It is some of the Jews went along with this and resulted in a lot of bad things. What is going to eventually happen over time? So he's going to have this power and do these things for a period of time. Eventually, he will die, and there is a revolt by the Maccabean family, Judas Maccabeus. And so he will construct a new altar for God, and they will start redoing the sacrifices. Let me get you the date on that. So the year that Antiochus does this is December of 167, but Judas Maccabeus is going to recapture Jerusalem and cleanse the temple. Well, I didn't write the year down, my bad. But does anybody know the holiday that commemorates Judas Maccabeus getting the temple back and cleansing the temple and setting up the new altar? Okay. So that's Hanukkah, okay? So when the Jews celebrate Hanukkah in December, that's what they're celebrating, okay? So the word Hanukkah is a Hebrew word that means dedication. And so the Hanukkah celebration is commemorating the rededication of the temple when the Jews took it back in their revolt against the Greeks and against Antiochus IV, okay? So that's what that's from. So Jesus actually celebrates that in John chapter 10, okay? So Hanukkah dates back to before the time of Jesus. All right, so that's kind of the background of what's going on here and what this chapter is going to be talking about. It's talking about this future event when this Greek ruler is going to come in and desecrate the temple and lead some of the Jews away in the process. All right, so going back to the text now, it says at the end of verse 11, it says, "And by him the daily sacrifices were taken away." So that means he eliminated the sacrifices to God. "And the place of his sanctuary was cast down." That means he desecrated the altar and erected a new pagan altar on top of it. Verse 12, "Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth down to the ground." That's talking about him burning the Torah. And he did all this and prospered. So he's doing all this stuff and he's prospering, but it's going to be for a limited period of time. All right, so verse 13, it says, "Then I heard a holy one speaking." So up to this point, Daniel's just seeing this vision unfold. He doesn't understand what it's all about. Now he's going to finally hear a voice. So it says, "I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking." So in other words, you got two angels talking back and forth, and Daniel's going to overhear their conversation, basically. So it says, one angel says to the other, "How long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot?" In other words, how long is God going to let this happen? Because they see this playing out in the future. They know this is an abominable situation. But what does this also tell you? It tells you they know God is in control. And God is not going to allow this happen any longer than God intends for it to happen. So he's asking the question, how long is God going to let this happen for? So verse 14, it says, "And he said to me," and there's debate about whether the angel is talking here to Daniel or he's talking to the other angel. It's not a huge deal either way. Either way, Daniel hears the response. So it says, for 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Yeah, that's interesting. I just noticed something. Let me see, verse 13. 14. Well, okay. Okay, so the New King James does something I didn't expect here. It actually makes it more confusing. So the New King James says, for 2,300 days. What is literally said in the Hebrew, which you will see like in the ESV, it says for 2,300 evenings and mornings. Okay, and you may think, well, that's the same thing, right? That's a day. It depends on how you interpret it. So literally what the Hebrew says is 2,300 evenings, mornings. No conjunction between the two. No, the word and isn't there. So what are evenings, mornings? Well, this is referring to the sacrifices that it just talked about a second ago. And so what happened is there was a continual sacrifice on the altar, and every evening they would offer a lamb on the altar and let it burn overnight. And the next morning you would offer another lamb on the altar and let it burn all day. So if you lived in Jerusalem and looked at the temple, there would always be a sacrifice on the altar. So if you're talking about 2,300 evening, morning, what it's actually talking about is not 2,300 evenings and mornings, as in 2,300 days. It's talking about 2,300 sacrifices. And so each day has two sacrifices. So it's really what it's talking about is 1,150 days, which equals 2,300 sacrifices, okay? So how long is 1,150 days? You don't have to get caught up in the exact number. It's roughly 3.5 years. How long did Antiochus IV do these things in Jerusalem and prevent the people from worshiping and all this stuff? Roughly 3.5 years, okay? It's not an exact, and it depends on when you measure the beginning and the end and all that. So, if it's off a couple weeks, big deal. But it represents roughly 3.5 years is about how long Antiochus controlled Jerusalem and made all these activities illegal, prevented the sacrifices at the temple, and so forth. All right, so verse 15, it says, then it happened when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meaning, that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. So this is an angel. Angels are often referred to in the Bible as having an appearance like a man, and so that's what's the case here. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulah, who called and said, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. All right, so now we're introduced to actually one of the angels by name. But it's interesting, it says there's a voice that calls out between the banks of the Ulah. What does that mean? Well, you have a bank here and the canal water in between. So if a voice comes out between the banks, then that means the person who called it out is hovering over the water. Okay? So who's hovering over the water that would call out and tell an angel what to do? God. Okay? It's just like in the New Testament when God calls out from the cloud and said, this is my son in whom I'm well pleased. It's the same kind of thing. So God is not talking directly to Daniel, but he's talking directly to Gabriel to go tell Daniel something. So it's kind of an interesting thing. So before the exile, God would directly talk to the people and interpret things for them. After the exile, God doesn't talk directly to the people anymore. He makes the angels talk to them. So he uses the angel as an intermediary. And that's what he's doing here. All right, so we're now introduced to Gabriel. Gabriel seems to be kind of God's go-to angel to interpret stuff for people. He's going to appear multiple times in this book, and then he's going to be the one who appears to Mary and to Zacharias to tell them about the coming birth of John and then Jesus, okay? The name Gabriel, and there's a play on words here in Hebrew, which is kind of geeky, neat, but you may not care. But anyway, his name means, you can see the L on the end, right? E-L. So the word God is in his name. It comes from Geber. You can see there's a G, a B, and an R there in his name. That's the base word. And that means like a warrior. Geber usually is a male that's a fighter, a strong, like a real good warrior. And so his name means like warrior of God. Some people try to spin it and say God is my warrior, but that doesn't really fit. So it probably means warrior of God is what his name means. And then the only other named angel is Michael, which means it means who is like God. So it's a rhetorical question. But Gabriel means warrior of God. All right, so he's telling Gabriel, go tell Daniel what's going on, basically. All right, so verse 17, so he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. All right, so a couple things. So Gabriel's talking directly to Daniel now. And remember, this is all still in the vision. And so a couple things are going on here. So one, even when an angel appears to a person, when they're there on behalf of God, it can be very terrifying to the human. And that's the second bell, right? So I'll just finish this verse up. So he's very afraid at what's going on. Secondly, Gabriel calls Daniel a son of man. Now, this is not the same idea as the son of man in chapter 7, which was referring to the Messiah. This is talking about him being a human. And this phrase is used over and over and over and over in Ezekiel, where God refers to Ezekiel as a son of man. Okay, so remember, Ezekiel and Daniel are contemporaries. They both live in Babylon. They both prophesy in Babylon about the same time. And so they're going to both use this phrase to talk about their humanity before God. But we'll stop there for tonight. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts? All right, so this chapter is a little easier. Two animals, a ram and a goat, and it's referring to the Medes and Persians and then the Greeks. And then the little horn is Antiochus IV, which we'll get into a little bit more next week. All right, good to see everybody. Have a good week.